Hi, everyone. We'll begin. Welcome to the launch of the Philip Roth Book Club at the Newark Public Library. We are thrilled to have biographer, scholar, and good friend of the Philip Roth Personal Library, Ira Nadel, with us today to discuss The Ghostwriter. And I am Nadine Sergeyev, the supervising librarian of the Philip Roth Personal Library. As you probably know, it's a very special day. Philip Roth would have been 89 today. This picture is from a photo album of Roth's 60th birthday party in Connecticut. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to visit the Philip Roth Personal Library if you haven't already done so. In addition to seeing thousands of books that the author read, we also have an exhibit in place. The collection includes much more than books. While the Library of Congress was given Roth's photographs and papers, we also have some treasures, including teaching notes we found in books, the author's many awards, and scrapbooks that his mother compiled, and much more. So please do visit. And we are also in the process of creating an accompanying catalog, which we hope to have available for sale in the near future. And I just wanted to remind you that if you wanted to consult any of the books and look at Roth's marginalia, you will have to make an appointment. And I mentioned treasures, and here are some of them. So here are source materials about Anne Frank for The Ghostwriter that are in the Philip Roth Personal Library. So we see page references, and we see the way that Roth underlined and marked some of the pages. And we also have typescripts donated by Roth's friend Joel Canaro, and we also have teaching notes, and you will see those very, very soon. And we do have a very robust crowd today. More than 80 people have registered, so we've opted to offer this presentation in a webinar format. We've received several questions through email, and we will try to address additional questions and comments. So please feel free to type in any questions or observations in the Q&A feature here in Zoom or in the chat. And since we have a lot to cover, I'd like to now introduce Mr. Ira Nadel.
Nadine, thank you so much, and thank you to the many people who I know are participating today in the inaugural Philip Roth Book Club meeting on such a wonderful day. Philip Roth would have been 89 years old today. It is his birthday. I also want to start by thanking Nadine, who is the supervising librarian of the Philip Roth Personal Library, and of course, the Newark Public Library, for organizing and sponsoring not just what we are about to begin, but for making possible the wonderful facility of the Philip Roth Personal Library. You must come and visit. And you must really begin to see the riches that are there. And the image that's up right now is one illustration of that. This is an incredible gold mine for students, for readers, for scholars, to be able to see the actual text that Roth himself was using as a source book for what becomes, of course, The Ghostwriter. And here we have his underlinings on page, what is that, 56 and 57 of the Diary of a Young Girl. That is Anne Frank's diary. Could we have the next slide, Nadine? Here is an example of the typescript, one of the early typescripts of the novel, and you can see how he altered, revised, changed passages. He was a constant reviser. You get the feeling when you begin to trace a text from its idea to its typescript to its first page proofs, etc., you almost feel his editor had to pull the manuscript away from him because he kept thinking of ways of improving what it is he's trying to say, which certainly relates to the character of Lonoff in The Ghostwriter. And in the next slide, Nadine, we could do that one. Is the next slide available? Yes, thank you. This is another remarkable document, which is at the Roth Personal Library. These are his teaching notes from the 14th of September, 1999, when he visits a class at Bard College to discuss the ghostwriter. And this is the sort of documentation and information that makes reading and understanding the book broader in a stronger context than just picking up the text and, beginning on page number 1. So again, I want to emphasize the great resources at the personal library. Now, what I want to do this morning, if we could just move on to the next slide, is to illustrate the ways in which this novel or novella, it's only 180 pages, came together, and some of the people who were instrumental in writing this book. First of all, Roth, of course. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context in a moment, but 2 other people are very important. The individual in the middle is the editor, Veronica Gang. She was an editor at the New Yorker magazine who wrote to Roth in the late 1970s to simply say, I think it's time for you to reappear in the New Yorker. What do you have? And he had been writing The Ghostwriter in London, by the way, in his studio in Notting Hill. And he sends her a version of the book, and they begin to work on it. And Veronica, again, did a very important thing when she read it the first time. She marched into the office of the editor of the New Yorker, William Shawn, and said, we must print this work in its entirety. And that is exactly what happened. And Roth found that the novel appeared in 2 issues in 1979 of the New Yorker, joining a very distinguished group of writers. John Hershey's Hiroshima appeared in its entirety in the New Yorker, Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, Truman Capote in Cold Blood. Now, for those who are unfamiliar, the individual to the left of Veronica Gang is our very important writer, Kundera, Milan Kundera, the Czech writer who had left the Czech Republic and had moved to Paris. Roth met him first in 1972 or 3 during his early visits to Prague, and Kundera became an important friend and, in a way, a kind of voice of the repressed writers in the Czech Republic during the 1970s. And readers probably recognize that The Ghostwriter is dedicated to Milan Kundera. Could we have the next slide, please? So what I want to do before we open this up, it is a book club. I'm not doing a seminar on The Ghostwriter, although I have hours of material, let me tell you, is set the novel into a bit of a context and then just very quickly talk about the structure of the book in its 4 parts. The context is crucial. I mentioned that Roth wrote the book in London. Roth had been spending time in the Czech Republic. He had been deeply moved by the repression of so many writers who found themselves no longer writers, but janitors and bus drivers, and working in terrible jobs because they were literally demoted and their identities changed. And one reaction of him to that situation was to begin a series called Writers from the Other Europe. And what it is 17 titles by Eastern European writers republished in North America with new introductions by people like Carlos Fuentes and Joseph Brodsky, John Updike, and Angela Carter. And these were very important titles because they introduced for the first time so many Eastern European writers like Kundera, like Bruno Schulz, to North American writers. This was a project of Roth's. It ran from, 1976 to 1983. So this is part of the backdrop for The Ghostwriter. And it's focused on, of course, European conditions, the Anne Frank story, the life of the artist, and survival. I think The Ghostwriter is absolutely about survival. One other quick context I want to mention it's more bibliographical. So where does the ghostwriter appear in the list of Roth's novels? Well, My Life as a Man appeared in 1974. That's his kind of writing out of his, I have to say, disastrous relationship with his first wife and the outcome of that. Then in 1977, he publishes The Professor of Desire about David Kepich and his time in Eastern Europe. And it's a very Russian book in the sense that Chekhov and Turgenev play major roles. And I want to mention at the very end of The Professor of Desire, published in 1977, there are references to the Holocaust. There's a character who is a friend of Kepich's father. The two men come to the kind of country house where Kepich is living with Claire, and there's a discussion of the Holocaust with this one particular figure who is a survivor. So Roth was already concerned with the Holocaust, how to address it, how to write about it. Following The Professor of Desire is The Ghostwriter, 1979, and it's the first serious introduction of the character Nathan Zuckerman. Zuckerman Unbound is the title of the work that follows The Ghostwriter, 1981, and then in 1983, The Anatomy Lesson. So how is The Ghostwriter structured? How is it put together? Well, it's retrospective, first of all. The setting of the book is 1956. Zuckerman is a young beginning author. He's 23 years old, but now he's looking back years later on the experience. The book has 4 parts, and each one is quite telling and important. The Maestro is part 1, or Master, and it's a reference to Henry James. Roth, as we know, had this incredibly career-long engagement with Henry James, and it began kind of as an undergraduate, kind of overtook his studies as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. The title, The Master, actually reflects a work by Henry James called The Lesson of the Master. It's also a novella. It was published in 1888, and the story is similar to The Ghostwriter. And I urge everyone to pick up The Lesson of the Master to get, if you will, the backstory of The Ghostwriter. And essentially, The Lesson of the Master is about a young writer who befriends a very famous novelist. They both fall in love with the same young woman. The famous novelist marries her at the end of the story and tells the young writer named Paul Overt he's actually saving him because he's ensuring that he will be able to devote himself to his art and not be distracted by this kind of romantic passion. Well, there are many overtones with, of course, The Ghostwriter. Second section of The Ghostwriter, Roth labels Nathan Dedalus with a direct reference, of course, to James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and the hero there, Stephen Dedalus, who is, like Nathan Zuckerman, discovering his vocation, and that is to be a writer. In The Ghostwriter, of course, Nathan has already published several short stories. He has one unpublished story which is circulating, which offends his father because of its particular theme about Jews and money. So the second part of The Ghostwriter is an allusion to Joyce and Portrait of the Artist. Part 3, which is almost the longest section of The Ghostwriter, entitled Femme Fatale, is about Amy Billette / Anne Frank. And this section becomes the most intriguing, and if people would like to use this term, one of the most postmodern aspects of this book, because we drift in and out of 2 consciousnesses. One is Amy, and then the story of Anne Frank. And the way that Roth presents it has been criticized because it's been seen as a very controversial demythologizing of the figure of Anne Frank. And in his notes and in letters and in statements that he's made to a number of biographers and critics, he explains that, in fact, that was his intention. He did not want to treat Anne Frank as a Jewish saint. He wanted to represent her as a young woman through whom the accidents of history and her writing down her experiences recorded a very painful and tragic experience, but that essentially she was a young woman who actually survived and is now, as we see, living in the Berkshires, working as an assistant to Manny Lonoff, the writer. She, I want to suggest, is one of 3 ghost writers in this particular work. So this is a terrifically important section, and it's a section that gave Roth a lot of trouble when he was writing it. The last and one of the shortest sections of the novel is entitled Married to Tolstoy. So here we have a third major reference to another writer. You start with Henry James in the first section, move on to Joyce in the second. I guess we could say we also then move on to Anne Frank as the diarist in the third. And now we turn to the author of Anna Karenina. But the focus, and here again, Roth is a bit sly in his treatment, is really Tolstoy's wife, Sophia. And she was 16 years younger than Tolstoy. And during a sometimes volatile, lengthy marriage to Tolstoy, by the way, she had 13 children, 8 of whom survived. During this entire marriage, she too kept a diary. And it's a diary that reflects the character of their long and, as I said, well, vibrant relationship. So again, literary reference, very powerful, very strong. What's interesting to me about The Ghostwriter is that it's a short book, but incredibly broad and expansive in terms of its presentation of a literary life, which is my transition to a very important theme, perhaps the major theme of The Ghostwriter. That is the role of art in life and the role of the reverse, the role of life in art. And there's a question which a character asks in the Henry James story, which I think is pertinent. This is back to the lesson of the master. What's art but an intense life if it be real? That one question, what's art but an intense life if it be real, could be seen as the prompt for what it is Roth is trying to address in The Ghostwriter. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about Manny Lonoff, the Jewish writer who doesn't think of himself as that Jewish, who's retired to the countryside, leading a very isolated life devoted to art. We could talk about Nathan as a young writer beginning to find his voice, which Lonoff says is the most important thing for any writer. It's not style, it's voice. And then we could talk about Anne Frank as a writer, in fact, the diarist, the historical Anne Frank, who is being, to use a slightly academic term, contested by Amy Billette. And we really have to make it clear that it's Zuckerman who fantasizes that Amy Billette is Anne Frank and imagines her in this other life, a life of the present, which again, Roth anticipated back in 1973 in his unusual story about Kafka. The subtitle is Looking for Kafka, where he describes Franz Kafka is alive and he's a Hebrew teacher in Newark, New Jersey. So I think there are a lot of overlays and a lot of connections. But I've talked too much and I would like to open this up. It is a book club. I'd like to have and hear from our audience with the first question, I think, that comes to mind for me, and I hope for you. What is the meaning of the title? Who is the ghostwriter, and why do you think Philip Roth titled the book The Ghostwriter? If you have questions, please put them up in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or you can put them up in the chat as well. I've made some suggestions that the book really incorporates at least 3 different writers, but I'd like to hear from people in the audience. Is the title the right title? Should it have been called something else? Nadine, do you have any comments from anyone?
No, not yet. So let's see. I encourage everybody just to type something into the chat or to use the Q&A feature here in Zoom.
While we're waiting for a question or two, I think what Roth is doing with the conception of Anne Frank is controversial. It's radical. And there are readers and critics who found that section of the book, the third section called the Femme Fatale, again, a reference to Keats, a reference to Oscar Wilde, even to Bizet's Carmen, very offensive because it harmed the kind of sanctified image of Anne Frank. And if you readers remember, there's the Judge Wappter that Nathan's father wants to correct Nathan's attitude towards the stories he's writing. And one of the things that Judge Wappter from Newark says to Nathan, you should go see the Broadway production of The Diary of Anne Frank. And I think it's that sort of thing that Philip Roth found offensive because he was trying to show a more complicated, a more complex Anne Frank than what, in a way, society had presented her at a Jewish society and Jewish writers. And that's one of the things. Remember, Roth was always determined to, I'll be euphemistic, step on people's toes. He was always trying to get a reaction from his readers and from his characters. Just think of Mickey Sabbath in Sabbath Theater. There's a character that you can't read 1 or 2 pages without feeling some sort of intense response. I think he was trying something parallel to that with the figure of Anne Frank, trying to make us see her in different ways.
So a few comments have come into your past questions, so I'm just going to read them all off for you, okay?
Sure.
Possibly the point is that every writer is a ghostwriter standing on the shoulders of others, and that's a comment from Roger. A comment from Joyce, possibly Roth had no one in mind, but possible Anne Frank more than others. Rosemary writes, all writers are ghosts and ghostwriters, influenced by the ghosts of previous writers. Paul chimes in, would Roth as writer be ghostwriter using voices of other writers in this section of the book? And then Karen says, I took the title to be very general and perhaps personal to address the inner force that causes writers to work.
Well, I think all of these comments contributed to an understanding of what the title could be. One of the greatest concerns of Roth is to try and define who is a writer and what should a writer do? How should a writer conduct herself or himself? And so the greater definition or the expanded definitions of a ghost writer, I think are all more than pertinent. I think they get to the core of Roth as a writer. and the efforts that he personally went through in his own writing, whether it's the Counterlife or whether it's the Plot Against America, to discover, and that's the word I would use, to discover the nature of being a writer, an author. And of course, this is part of the great change which occurs in the early part of his career from his first two novels to Portnoy's Complaint, when he discovers that his own kind of psychological issues could become the subject of a novel, plus his experiences growing up Jewish in Newark. Then I think we get very close to his own sense of self-discovery as a writer. So I think that the notion of a ghost writer is intentionally ambiguous, but at the same time, given the nature of the story that he's constructed, real, applicable to the situation that he is outlining in this particular book. And we haven't really said anything about Lunoff, because Lunoff is, or has become, a ghost writer. He's moved out of the public's eye. He is not seeking public attention. He's purposefully put him outside, if you will, the main literary circles. Nobody's talking about it. And that's part of the reason why I think Lunoff is interested in meeting the young Nathan Zuckerman, because someone is attending to him and to his career. And then, of course, when Zuckerman goes, he discovers that Lunoff has, even in his own home, ghosted himself. He's removed himself from the immediate situation of living. Hence the difficulties with Hope, his wife. What a marvelous name, that she should be called Hope Lunoff. And then at the same time, the discovery that Lunoff is having a relationship with Amy Vallette. But I think there's some more questions or comments. Nadine?
Yes, I'm here. Additional question. Did you talk about the encounter with his father? Do you think this is a reaction to Portnoy's Complaint public reaction?
Actually, I do not. And the reason I say that is that Roth's mother and father took great pride in the attention, publication of Portnoy's Complaint. And there's the well-known story that just before the book was to appear, he has lunch with his parents in New York. And he says to them, I want you to be prepared. A book's coming out. It's going to create a lot of fury. A lot of people are going to be upset, but don't worry. The book will probably be read by many, many people. And then the parents left. And in the cab going back to Newark, the mother said to the father, I feel so sorry for Philip. I can't believe he has these illusions of grandeur. It's never going to happen. We don't have to worry. And she actually started crying because she thought that he had overstated the reaction to the book. And when the book came out, he warned them, don't do interviews, and they didn't. But they were very pleased with the attention, and he sent them on a trip with some of the money that he had received. They took a cruise. They ended up in Israel, and the father brought about, I don't remember the exact number, let's say 20 copies of the book. And he was so pleased that people knew about it, he gave them away, and he said, and I'll get the book signed. And he went to his cabin, and he signed the book from Philip Roth's father, Herman Roth. And so people were very proud, and they were proud. So no, I don't think it's a reaction. I think the situation between Nathan Zuckerman and his father was partly Roth's relationship with his father, but not as a writer, not Roth as a writer. Growing up, Roth had many challenges in terms of freeing himself from his father's control as a teenager, as an early university student. Yes, to that extent. But the parents really were not, to my understanding anyway, offended by the kind of work that Roth was publishing. But I think he creates this kind of trope in the story in order to give more of an edge to the theme of fatherhood, because Nathan is looking for a kind of literary father. And that's one of the reasons why he wants to go and to meet Lonoff, and why he is so moved by the opportunity.
Was she really Anne Frank? Did she delude herself she was Anne Frank, or did Zuckerman imagine knowingly that she was Anne Frank?
The crux of the whole section. Amy Billette does not believe she is Anne Frank. This is Nathan Zuckerman's invention. And he partly invents her because one of the charges brought against Nathan is that he's anti-Semitic. It's partly suggested by his father, and it's institutionalized by the judge, by Judge Wachter. Okay, in that marvelous satiric questionnaire that Roth writes, which we read in the book. To counter that, Nathan imagines that this woman, who has the name of Amy Billette, is really Anne Frank. And he falls in love with her immediately and decides that he's going to marry her to prove to his parents and to prove to his readership he's anything but anti-Semitic. He's marrying this Jewish saint, who, by the way, is alive, and she didn't die at Bergen-Belsen. So this upends that whole myth. And I think one of the marvelous things that Roth does in the story, as we slip into Anne Frank's consciousness, is that Anne Frank realizes, remember now this is Zuckerman's invention of Anne Frank, she has to remain dead. She cannot be discovered as alive because it will undo, it will deconstruct the Anne Frank myth and the story. And she knows that she has to, and the line appears 2 or 3 times in the book, she has to remain dead, because otherwise this whole idea of what she represents will be destroyed. But it is Nathan who imagines the existence of Anne Frank. And quickly to go on for 1 second, this is confirmed later when Roth revisits this novel 20 years after in Exit Ghost, where we see the aged Zuckerman, we meet the aged Amy Billette, who tragically is suffering from a brain tumor, and then a biographer appears, Richard Kleiman, who thinks he can really tell the proper story of Lonoff and why Lonoff never finished this novel that he had been working on for years. So it's very interesting that Roth doesn't really finish The Ghostwriter until he writes Exit Ghost in 1999. Good question.
Is Lonoff's cruelty to his wife Roth's means to debunk artistic greatness?
Artistic greatness?
Correct.
I think not so much greatness as artistic privilege. That is to say, I am a writer, I am a full-time writer, and I want everything else in the background, and I want everyone else in the background. A great example of that is the British satiric writer Evelyn Waugh, who said the worst 10 minutes of every day was when he had to see his children. It was a disruption. It was an interference. And I think Lonoff, who has grown children, is capitalizing again on the cliche of the author who has to be isolated, who has to be in a tower. And Strindberg, the dramatist, was himself, put himself into a tower to do his writing and to create his plays at a certain point in his life. And even Yeats, the great Irish poet, bought a tower and lived in a tower to write. That sense of isolation, that sense of purity, is derives in part from Henry James. You need the isolation for the concentration. And it's just a half step to say, oh, maybe that's why Roth bought this 18th century farmhouse in Western Connecticut, Cornwall Bridge, so that he didn't have to associate with people he didn't want to. And besides, it was distracting. And so I think Lonoff's attitude is unsympathetic, certainly, to Hope, but at the same time, they've had a long 30+ year relationship. And what's interesting to see and try and understand in the story is what happens in the last section that causes Hope to finally leave. And I think the answer is Amy, where she finally realizes that Lonoff is quite attractive. It's more than attraction. He's quite maybe obsessed, might be a little strong, in terms of this presence of Amy Billette in his life. And of course, we have Nathan, who's providing another kind of perspective. This is also partly connected to the life of Bernard Malamud, who some argue is a model for Manny Lonoff, E.I. Lonoff. Malamud, like Lonoff, was very formal. He was always formally dressed. He was always very precise in greeting people and treating them more or less the way Lonoff treats Nathan and others. And he was considered to be repressed in his own particular way. However, after his death, and of course Roth knew him and they had a kind of a formal relationship, but after his death, it was discovered that Malamud had something like a 16-year affair with one of his students. In fact, the student even invited him to her wedding and he happily went. So suddenly you have what you have in the ghostwriter, discovery of something that was hidden, but still very important. It was almost a kind of fuel for the writer. So it's another way in which the idea of a ghost or some aspect that is not foregrounded shapes the artist. And I think the Hope Lonoff's relationship with her husband is a very troubling one that finally she cannot accept any longer. And so she leaves in a snowstorm at the end, and Lonoff goes after her. But isn't this characteristic of a Chekhov story or of a Roth novel? We don't know what happened. We don't know. He does not give us a scene where he finds her body in the snow because she got lost and froze to death. There's a parallel, I guess I have to mention, with the writer Leon Uris, whose second wife also left the house in fury. They were living in Aspen, Colorado, and she did disappear, and her body was found the next morning. So how curious. The writer whose wife basically can't take it anymore. How much isolation can a person experience?
Great. The questions are pouring in. I'm trying to go in order. We just answered another one inadvertently about Malamud, so that one's covered. I'm going to skip ahead because this question builds on what we were just talking about now. In your opinion, why are most of Roth's characters so unsympathetic?
Unsympathetic. Well, some would argue they are not all unsympathetic. Reaction to Portnoy, Alexander Portnoy, by a certain slice of readership was fantastic. Great. We've been waiting for someone like that to liberate us from the restraints of the, say, 50s. And here in 1969, we have found a character who's educated, who's articulate, who is not a writer, very important to stress that, and I can identify with him. I mean, why did that book have such astonishing sales? Mickey Sabbath, a great character to offend everyone, everyone. It's almost impossible to find someone who admires Mickey Sabbath, with the exception of Philip Roth. At Philip Roth's 80th birthday party held in Newark, with a wonderful conference at the library and then an event at the Newark Museum, when Roth took the stage, and after he thanked everyone, he said, I'm going to read something. And he read from Sabbath's Theater. And he read a very emotional section of the novel where Mickey Sabbath goes to Asbury Park at the Jersey Shore and walks through the Jewish cemetery. And what does he do? He reads the gravestones. And then there's the moment with Cousin Fish, who's 100 years old, and he gets his, Mickey Sabbath gets the brother's box of things and wraps the flag around him and goes to the seashore. That's very moving. That's very difficult to object to resist. So even if it's an unsympathetic character, what Roth does is show us moments in these characters' lives that do open up our reaction to them. And certainly in the Plot Against America, I think the representation of the Roth family is anything but unsympathetic. So I think we have to be careful with that generalization about unsympathetic characters. They are not all unsympathetic by any means.
Okay.
Another comment.
Question from Jim. We Work in the Dark begins the quotation from Henry James' The Middle Years, tacked up in Lonoff's study where Zuckerman spends the night. Does this quote speak to Roth's understanding of writers' vocation and of the ghostly darkness in which writers work?
Well, darkness is a complex term, and I think it does, but he says, I think, misremembering exactly the quote, but art is our passion, and the passion is our art. You start with the unknown. Roth himself wrote about this quite a bit. You find it in letters and you find it in essays, where he talks about, when I start a book, I don't know really where it's going. But to me, that is the great excitement. And that is the act, I've said it several times now, of discovery. He has maybe the broadest sense, I want to write a story involving or incorporating Anne Frank. However, I don't know how it's going to work. And this is partly why, one, he needs to go through so many revisions and changes, and two, his marvelous habit, really, of sending out a draft of the book before it's going to be published to a select group of readers, close friends, whose opinions he can trust. And what he wants, as he said to Claudia Roth Pierpont in her account of Roth, is, I don't want you to tell me, the sections that are wrong. I want you to describe to me what the book is about, because that way I will get a clearer understanding of what it is I am trying to do. And I think that's a very helpful comment, and it does relate to the quotation from James that Lonoff had over his desk, the sense of starting in darkness and ending up not in any kind of super bright light, but illumination of one sort or another. Roth, as a reviser and reader of his own works, I think is a very important topic that we need to look at much, much more carefully. Every one of his books has gone through a tremendous set of iterations until he feels it's right. And this, of course, takes us right back to Lonoff and his statement, I turn sentences around. I write a sentence and then turn it around again. So this is Roth. This is Roth. And this is one reason why he needed to be isolated, or at least separated from the glittering literary world of New York that is defined by publicity and gossip and so many stories about his personal life, which of course he, in a way, generated. I mean, to begin a relationship with Claire Bloom, one of the most noted actresses or actors of the day, is obviously going to bring tremendous attention on him and his work. And their life in London is a very important aspect of his writerly life as well. Because what he needed to do, and he did it, is he found his own writing space. He rented a studio in Notting Hill, but he and Claire Bloom lived in Chelsea. And so he had a routine where he went to that studio, and that's where he worked. Now, there were issues with Bloom's daughter, but we won't get into that right at this point. So this idea of the writer in a tower is, I think, quite fundamental to understanding Roth. And yes, I think that quote is a very helpful one in understanding not only Roth, but the writing practices of Philip Roth.
A question from Margot. Isn't the switch to the third person in Femme Fatale suggestive of other alternative explanations, that it's Zuckerman's notes for a later account?
Yes, I think so. I think it's part of the experimental dimension of this book. And I think people who read the book quickly imagine that that's really Anne Frank, who's up there in the Berkshires. It's a subtle shift. And I think you have to study individually or with a group, you study the ghostwriter to see how Roth slips into this other point of view, as it used to be called. Point of view, by the way, was a term long associated with reading Henry James, who also would shift and a narrative. Henry James gets it from George Eliot, who may have found this experimental dimension in Jane Austen. So we have a long tradition here, a literary tradition. But yes, I think that Roth is testing certain limits in terms of how do you present a character, a historical character, I've used the term earlier, a saintly character, and yet be critical or honest in rethinking that character's significance. And I think his solution is very smart. That is to say, it's Nathan Zuckerman who imagines Amy as Anne Frank, not Philip Roth. Not Philip Roth in actuality, the author. He had a lot of trouble with the Anne Frank character. He wanted to write about Anne Frank in the 1970s, early 70s, and I think it partly grew out of his engagement with Kafka. And it took him quite a while. Again, if we go into the archive at the Library of Congress for the ghostwriter, you're going to see different phases and the way in which he struggles to get that Anne Frank character properly presented in this story. She's framed by Zuckerman and Lonoff and Amy Follett. And then what we want to do is trace out the fate of Anne Frank in Exit Ghost. We know the fate of Amy, but we need to know something about Anne Frank.
From Paul, could you elaborate what you mean by Roth's project to discover what it means to be a writer, as in a writer in the world?
Okay, that's, again, not an easy question to answer quickly. If we look at Roth's career, he goes through many stages, which is part of the excitement. I mean, there's the burlesque stage. After Portnoy's Complaint, we have his baseball novel. We have his short satiric piece on Nixon. We have a whole variety of other forms and styles that he's experimenting with. What if the breast is another example of that. So it takes a writer with the talent and imagination of Roth time to find the route, the direction you want to go. And I think for good writers, there is no single direction. You do not want them to write the same book over and over again. And this is the one point shared between Philip Roth and Norman Mailer. Mailer was asked time and time again, write a sequel to The Naked and the Dead. You know, do The Naked and the Dead in Europe. You've done The Naked and the Dead in the Pacific. And he utterly refused. He said, absolutely not. I need to find new work, new forms. And I think Roth faced that as well. There are some letters that want him to write, these are in the archives of his publishers, a sequel to Portnoy's Complaint. Portnoy's Complaint, Part 2, Portnoy in California, or Portnoy, you know, in Pennsylvania. We've had Portnoy in New Jersey and New York. Give Pennsylvania a chance. And he refused. That's not what he believed a writer should do. That is to repeat oneself, whether in story or character. However, having said that, we do recognize Zuckerman appears in a range of novels. But Zuckerman in, say, The Human Stain is quite different than Zuckerman in The Ghost Writer. So there is no one formula for Philip Roth, and I think that's a very good thing. That's what keeps us reading his works. Look at the last 3 books. They are also so different, Nemesis, for example, than what had preceded them. The only thing you might say is that they're shorter books. That's the difference, or The Humbling. So for me, this variety is one of the reasons why I keep reading Philip Roth. And every time I've discovered something stronger about him as a writer. We also have to say the voice shifts somewhat. It's not all Portnoy. The voice in Nemesis is a very tempered voice. The voice in The Plot Against America is an anxious voice because it's a voice that senses and sees and understands what's happening to America. But again, this to me is the great appeal. I never know what I'm going to find when I pick up a Philip Roth novel. Nadine.
We have about 6 minutes left. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We have 2 additional questions, so I'll get to those now. Do you think, a question from Natalie, do you think hope returned after the end of the novel?
No. Next question. No, I don't want to be that assertive. I think it's a great discussion question. And I think we should have at least another hour on the future of Hope Lonoff. And maybe this would be a Rothian twist. She goes off to write her own novel about life with Lonoff. And we get Ghostwriter 2, but she could be another ghostwriter. This is a very interesting idea. I hadn't considered that before. No, I hope, no pun intended, she does not return. That in fact, she has discovered her own need for freedom and independence, because clearly Lonoff has, I wouldn't say destroyed, but created an environment where she is not herself. She's very much like a Chekhov character, because in the book, and we haven't spoken about all the many Russian writers that appear in the book, but she says at one point, Boston, or Lonoff says, Boston is her Moscow. And what he's referring to is, of course, The Three Sisters by Chekhov, where the entire play is, how can we get to Moscow? How can we leave the countryside? We've had it, nothing's happening. This is boring, this is terrible, we need to get to Moscow. So she's going to Moscow. But for her, of course, it's Boston. So no, I don't think, in fact, I would say I hope she doesn't return, because it's reached a point where Lonoff's dependency on her is no longer viable, is no longer acceptable, because she finally recognizes the importance of Amy for Lonoff, that kind of secret life has now come forward, and therefore she needs to finally take her own steps and free herself. But I want her to write. In fact, when we finish this discussion, I am sending a postcard to Hope Lanoff. I think I can get the address from the novel and ask her, how is her book coming? When will it appear?
And from Susanna, at the beginning of the book, Zuckerman talks about writing its Bildungsroman. We have an understanding of Roth's work as a Bildung of Zuckerman's. When he leaves the scene to instead of talking about himself, talk about the state of American things as an American pastoral and human stain. Would this be the moment when he becomes a great writer?
It's the first steps, and I'm glad you mentioned American writer, because there is an undercurrent of an American literary tradition, in the novel, by location, by geography. Another great approach to Roth would be to read him geographically. I would love to see something like a gazetteer of the works of Philip Roth, that is a reference book defined in terms of place. And so what we have is the Berkshires, the home, so to speak, of Melville and of Hawthorne. In that entire New England panorama, you've got Emerson, you've got Thoreau, you've got so many more. And this is another discovery that Roth makes, the American dimension of landscape and where he has set his stories. The Human Stain is another book, of course, where this becomes very important. So yes, I think the questions are accurate, but I think they're just the first steps. And it takes a fair number of books before Zuckerman can feel confident, and he may never really feel confident as an American capital A writer, but I think Roth did. And I think by the time he writes A Plot Against America, even though he's written a tremendous amount about American life, he accepts himself as an important American novelist. But in the 70s, this shift or turn to Eastern Europe, to the Holocaust, continuing the Jewish theme, becomes, I think, part of his ethos. And what brings that on is not just history, it's his living in Europe, his living in England, his new associations with a whole series of European writers, people like Milan Kundera, Primo Levi, very, very important, Aaron Applefield in Israel. So he begins to surround and, more importantly, to see the nature of these writers and what they have gone through in order to write. And he's always making comparisons to himself and a kind of freedom that he's experienced and what they have not. Go ahead.
Quickly, just 3 last comments and questions. So Elaine wanted to share that she grew up with Philip and recognizes many of the characters. And then Jim notes that, oh, she lives in Moscow, Idaho, where she runs a B&B with Drenka's widower. And and just, I guess, the last question, why was this book our inaugural choice?
I think it's a pivotal book in terms of the growth of Roth's career. It's one of his most successful books in terms of critical reception. I think it completed, in an odd way, I'm just now looking for one little figure here, it completed an address to Europe that he needed to make. And I think it's a great beginning book. I hope it's known to many in terms of the career and what, in fact, he was doing. Oddly, the book was not a bestseller. It only sold, and I just saw the figure, less than 15,000 copies, which is extraordinary. So this is a very important feature, that the book, admired, was not by any means popular. Of course, it was popular and read now, in Jewish studies programs, in seminars on Philip Roth, but it did not come close to the sales of his two bestsellers. And I mean books that sold 800,000 copies, and in paperback even more, and they are Portnoy's Complaint and The Plot Against America. So you might say, kind of at the beginning and towards the latter part of his career, the career is bookended by two truly bestsellers. And in between, he wrote books that were generally critically admired, but in terms of sales, no. And The Ghostwriter was not a bestseller. I hope people see the book now in a broader context and think about so many of the issues that he particularly addressed. Again, the central one about the relationship of art to life, and does life pay dearly in the name of art? Because that's clearly what Lonoff, represents here. And that's the challenge to Nathan Zuckerman at the end of the story. For those of you who are wondering, but if you read Exit Ghost, you know that he does not marry Amy Bellette, nor does he marry Anne Frank. Who does he marry? What does he marry? His art, his writing. And so in that sense, he fulfills Lonoff's admonition to stay with your art, stick with your art. This is exactly what the famous writer in The Lesson of the Master tells the young writer in that book as well. Roth, his own life, we have to talk about that at another book club gathering. Perhaps we should just mention in the remaining moments the forthcoming schedule. And here we are. If I can comment briefly, we have James Blum from Muhlenberg College, a wonderful Roth scholar, talking about Indignation, one of the later books in Roth's career. That's on May 21st. Then we have Matthew Shipe, who is the president of the Philip Roth Society. We'll be talking about a very challenging novel, structurally and narratively, The Counterlife. That's on June 18th. And then on the 10th of September, Amy Pazorski, one of the co-editors of Philip Roth Studies, will focus on the Pulitzer Prize winning book, American Pastoral. So I know I'm attending all three of these book club meetings, and I hope everyone else does as well. So let me personally thank everyone who joined this afternoon, and it's been a great pleasure. And I hope that you continue to think about the ghostwriter and how it operates, how it functions as a kind of stepping stone into the other Roth works. And again, I want to thank Nadine and the Newark Public Library, and urge everyone to visit the Philip Roth Personal Library. So thank you, everyone, and thank you again, Nadine.
This was fascinating, and I hope everyone enjoyed Ira's insight as much as I have. Because everyone in attendance is already a member of the book club, you'll automatically be receiving information about the future meetings. And they're also listed on our website, which you see here on the screen, prpl.npl.org. I would like to thank Ira Nadel for leading the program today, and to all of you for registering and for showing so much interest and for your great questions. And I'd also like to thank Diego from our IT department for his assistance today. Thank you so much and have a great day.